You're tuned into RX Radio. Movement prescribed. Brought to you by Prescript.com. A personalized approach to keeping you healthy and making your best even better. Your hosts, Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Jordan Jinta.
Yeah, well, that's what I kind of wanted to talk to you about. Like, I feel like there's a short list of people that actually get it, and they're like some sort of Romeo and Juliet in the bushes, like feeding the guy all the lines, and then there's someone out there just espousing stuff. It's like, this guy doesn't. If you ask one follow-up question to this guy, he doesn't know what the fuck you just said.
Yeah,
it sounded really good. And then there's you in the center of the black hole with the flashlight, finding all the answers.
Instead of being a soundbite master.
Yeah, well, it's hard, man. Like, that's what the medium of delivery has forced people to be. I can't help but think about, like, so a lot of you people listening to the podcast have probably saw the OHPS, the Online Human Performance Summit, which was cool. You know, the big collective guy, Kyle Dobbs, and those guys from Compound Performance and all that. They put together like a great thing. And one of, I think one of the more thought-provoking people in the industry right now is Pat. But, I had such a laugh because there's this soundbite to him losing his goddamn mind about not having slides. But I think about it, because I was on his Instagram today, because, I know a lot of people that Pat says that next thing you know, it's coming out of their mouth. Like, not with a day of experience, not with a single kilogram of muscle ever gained. And it's just but I looked at his Instagram today. Context. And I looked at his Instagram today. I was like, Pat, you know why they're so mad about slides? It's because your whole Instagram account is slides. It's all slides. And you show up to a performance summit thing with empty-handed, other than just your northeastern attitude. But it's weird.
I love the comment that you dropped on one of his posts. I just can't get my head around how you just use Instagram as Twitter.
He's just dad. He's smart fitness industry dad trying to figure out technology. And it's just for fuck's sakes, dad, stop holding the FaceTime up to your ear. I'm just looking at the side of your face. I can see you. That's how he uses technology. But yeah, it's tough, man. Because for better or for worse, the industry does seem to gravitate towards credibility, or rather notoriety over credibility, right? I remember we met in Manchester, and it was at FLF. It was a big space. Ben was up there doing his thing, and I was I've heard Ben spiels 10,000 times in a day, right? I'm pretty sure he rattles them off in his sleep. And so I was just kind of I'm not going to get in anyone's way, so I funneled around the back, and the next thing you know, I forget what we were talking about, some sort of cable line of pull moment profile vector. And I was like, who the fuck just formed what? And I looked over and I was just all right, I don't know who this guy is, but he's not going to escape my life anytime soon. So I guess for people new to you, give them a little bit of background about your background.
Oh, we're rolling now.
A bit of oh yeah, dude. We don't do anything professional around here, right? This conversation is happening whether or not the podcast is there. Just give a bit of background, man, a bit of insight, bit of as you said, context. Because I definitely think on the up and coming now, I'm lucky in a sense that I get to keep kind of what I think to be a finger on the pulse as people but the good graces funnel through the level 1 program, and I get to see eyes on coaches that have found their way to the further depths and bowels of the internet when it comes to content. And you're definitely someone that I think is worthy of a lot of praise when it comes to just thinking critically and contextually around the things that we can learn. So give a little bit of background, man.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of what I am. I'm just kind of in the trenches coach still, but I'm kind of branching off down different, paths, if you like. So I've done a postgraduate diploma in performance nutrition, so I've got a little bit of a interest in the nutritional field, but I also the physics side of things, biomechanics side of things, which is why I did your Prescript course, which is, awesome, by the way, guys, if you haven't done it. Plug. But yeah, so I've done that, I'm still doing some of Tom Purvis's RTS courses and stuff like that. So I like to get my information from, the different educators that I deem to be, the leaders of the field. And then, like you say, I just kind of take that information and apply the context that I feel it needs to fit into. And Yeah, I guess that's just kind of what my practice is built from, really, an amalgamation of like multiple different educators' information and just kind of making my own sort of morph thing of that.
Well, that's the thing, right? That's where I think a lot of coaches go wrong. Like you always describe like the tree, like the branches of coaching. And I think that's such an interesting model because like I'm well aware of what branch I reside on, right? Like, and I don't claim to, I don't give proclamation to other leaves on other twigs on other branches, right? Because like, you did like the master's level precision nutrition. It's like, I don't know nutrition, man. Like I'll be the last guy to ask about like, biochemistry. And like, I know what like oxidative phosphorylation is. And I could probably poke the Krebs cycle if it like came into my room. But I think a lot of like, and I know my role, like I sit on my branch and when people come to it, I try and riff a little bit on biomech but I think at the end of the day, what coaches do is that they get fixated. Like I was this way. Like I had a really good, not saying I'm really good, but I had an instructor I really liked in high school. And that's why I started my history and political science major. So I was like, I liked history so much because I liked this guy so much that I was willing to like go 2 years into like a PhD route in history going like, wait a minute, what am I doing here? Where like, I think a lot of people lose sight now. Like, have you ever heard the saying, specialization is for insects?
I haven't heard that one, no.
So it's like, I think it's pretty pertinent to the fitness industry. That super specialization is for insects, right? And it's like, as a coach, and I think one thing you do really well is you go to someone like Tom, who's like, he's a super specialist, right? Tom Purvis is a rare breed of human. You go to like, a Berardi and a Precision Nutrition, where that's a super specialist. But you don't try and become Precision Nutrition. You don't try and become Tom Purvis. Right. I think that's something like, and to a deeper metaphysical level about identity in the fitness industry, and that's maybe a podcast for another time. But I think what you do really well is you contextualize, like what is the overarching principle of that branch over there and that branch over there, and then at the end of the day, like how much of this matters when we're actually training a client?
Yeah, that's kind of the main point, right? I think it's one of those where you got to pick the right tool for the right job, and it's like the quality of a coach to me is determined by the complexity of the problems that they can solve. So it's like no one's paying no offense to any cleaners, but no one's paying any cleaners $200K a year, are they? Because it's a pretty simple problem to solve. But a brain surgeon or someone might get paid significantly more because the problems that they're solving are harder to solve. So I think that if you've got the capacity to solve those more complex problems, then you're able to serve to a better magnitude or a better degree, a wider percentage of the population, if you like. So I think that it just opens up more. I guess you can explain things to people instead of just like telling them, what an expert says. You can kind of explain a little bit of why you're telling them to do a certain thing and get them to understand and buy into it a little bit more because you've got a certain level of understanding or a decent level of understanding across a certain amount of subjects instead of just being extremely specialized in one and having to pass the book. I don't know.
Well, yeah, because I think what you do is a scary model to take on because it's one that's entirely hinging on the backs of your own responsibility, right? Where it's like if you ascribe to a certain system or method that you've gone onto a branch and you've really augured in and you start to find an identity with being a precision nutrition coach or an RTS level 1 or 2 or whatever, then when the system fails, it's the system that failed, it was not you that failed. But like simultaneously as you take on that responsibility, you take on scarcity and value essentially, right? And that's what's, especially in the current landscape, that's what's going to get a lot of coaches by this is, are you deemed essential? Because like I think there's a bit of an inferiority complex built around coaching that when you do it right, you never worry about that again. Like when someone goes to you like, oh, you've changed my life as a trainer, that's like, I think, and a lot of it is to do with barrier of entries being quite low and the standard of education being quite low, which is opened up, hey, great for us, man, right? Because that's opened up a market and a platform for you and what you do and being able to contextualize. Because I think what trainers run into is, and I want to get your opinion on this, is they want to make people think that they can't train without them, where the goal should be to make them want you to never have to.
Yeah.
Right? So like that complexity is like it's job security through obscurity, which I think is something you do really well, going like, look, we talk advanced topics, and I want to riff a little bit on that today, but like talk a little bit about the importance of like making it palatable. Like, what is the goal here?
Yeah, and I think self-sufficiency is always going to be the goal for most, general population people. I think that, like you say, we don't want to make someone absolutely rely on us, like for the entirety of their life, just for repeat business. I think it would be better to get repeat business through increasing someone's competence and then them just training with you because they want to learn the next thing that you learn, or they just really want to nail down, execution or whatever it is, because they've got to a level where they understand macros, they understand energy balance, they can kind of, set an exercise up and not look like they're melting on a machine, and, just kind of get to that point where they don't need you, but they're just choosing to still work with you because you're still bringing some important stuff to the table that they're making use of.
What was the first investment you made? What was the first investment in your education? Yeah, like not like stocks or bonds or property or Tesla or like Bitcoin, but like first time you said, okay, like I'm dissatisfied with my current level or the level of the industry. I'm going to make a change with myself. I'm going to go into.
That's got to have been, I guess, like you could call the first investment was probably one of the first coaches that I hired to work with myself when I was, coming into the industry. Like I've probably had coaches every year through my, entire fitness career, if you like. And back in like 2015, 2014, I think I went to one of Mark Cole's, his body transformation camps and stuff like that. So I was starting to get into like the seminar scene, around about that sort of time. And just from that point, like, you get into networking, you meet with the like-minded individuals, and you start to create like a little bit of a circle of people that you trust in the industry, and you get a better direction of who to learn from, because there's that much information spouted that you don't know who to kind of listen to sometimes, because everyone's evidence-based, and someone will say one thing on one side and then they'll be contradicted by another expert, and then it's like, well, who the fuck do I listen to? So I think the more people that you can kind of come into contact with, and they will then know other trustworthy people, and you can build that sort of network of reliable industry, thought leaders, if you like, to sculpt your practice from.
Yeah, and I think there's two big takeaway points there. One, like you can hire a coach, and I think a lot of people hire a coach for very like a unidimensional purpose, where it's like, I remember I interned at a chiropractic college with this guy who had a practice in Los Gatos, which is like, Los Gatos at one point in the last 10 years was the most expensive real estate in the country. Heart of the Silicon Valley, VC Central. Like you go up Kennedy Road, man, houses there blow your hair back. Like you're not getting a tent on Kennedy Road for less than $10 million US. And I remember going out to lunch with this guy, and like when he went out to lunch, he's like, look, like this is what we do. Like we don't serve food, but we still provide a service. So like this is like, we went to this restaurant called Nick's next door. It's like Michelin fucking class joint. Yeah. And he's like, I learn every time I go to Nick's more about my practice. Right. And I'll come back to Nick's and I'll pay more money because of and he talked about like the intangibles, like, the service. They fold up your fucking, your napkin for you when you go to the John. Right. Like, and so he's like, okay, obviously I don't have napkins and people aren't going on toilet breaks and things like that, but how can I start to emulate this level of service? Or vice versa, when he goes to a restaurant he doesn't like, he's appraising like how it is that this place is offering and providing a service and where he might improve it, and how this lateral means of thinking can actually improve his business, which is different in service. So I think like a lot of people look at the coaching industry and go, well, I'm going to get a coach because I want results with my physique or with my strength or whatever prep for a show. It's like, if you're a coach with a coach, it's like your check-in systems, processes, time management, right? And then of course, education, right? So much of what I do with my clients is explaining the why, because that builds buy-in. And the more I can peak buy-in, the more I'm going to get like the peak transformation or the peaks in season performance and things like that. And then the second thing is you highlighted the importance of the human network, right? Because so much of the industry is driven on social network. But it's like, there you were, man, in Manchester, FLF, and like, dude, we were elbow to elbow. Like, I know probably 20 or 30 of those, or 20 of those guys on a first name basis now. Right. And we all interconnect. And then at the level one, it's like, I had someone reach out to me the other day and like, asked me if I knew someone here. And I was like, oh, Matt's your guy. Or someone reached out to me the other day about the Middle East. I was like, oh, go see Daph. And it actually may have been Daph that I put Daph on to you, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to take credit where credit's not due.
We were speaking to each other before we did the PS level one, but like when we've both seen that each other had signed up to it, we're like, oh, you're doing, Jordan's, you're doing Jordan's course. Like, oh, hi, friend. Like,
yeah, you're either both crazy or you're both onto something. But no, like I think that's because like you said, there's so much information, right? Like, I guess one thing I think, other than like having a human network, like how do you go about your vetting process? Because you are compiling like such a body of work when it comes to your own personal experience, that as that surmounts, it can start to actually negate what you can hear, which I think is something that people shy away from. Like, what's your filtration process? How do you synthesize? Because I know you go deep in the theoretical, but I think you do a really good job in bringing it to applied. Give me like, okay, a thought enters your idea, or a thought enters your head, an idea enters your head. What is the process of going from like research, maybe finding conflicting research, to like putting pen to paper? Like, how is it that you synthesize information?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that's kind of, like you say, it's hard to sift through things and not end up down a rabbit hole through information that you just don't really need to be reading. Because like, when we're doing like the nutrition qualification, you find yourself like looking into certain pathways and you just think like, I'm never going to need to fucking tell anyone this, and that's when I'll kind of like, is this relevant and how relevant is it? And I guess it's how big of a chunk is this piece of information that I'm researching in the grand scheme of the puzzle. It's like, so we've got 1,000 jigsaw puzzle and we've got a bunch of pieces. It's like, what are the pieces I'm missing and how do I kind of, like you say, find the contrasting information for those things. So I'm not just like buying into, 2 papers or something like that. I'll kind of go on, do a dirty Google Scholar search and find some reviews or meta-analysis and stuff like that to try and get some consensus stands on where the general literature is on a certain topic. And I think like when you're looking at stuff like stretching, like you'll get one people on one side of the fence like, oh yeah, stretching shit, and then other people are like, oh yeah, everyone should stretch everything. And I think a lot of the time the truth's somewhere in between, and you just need to find where it's applicable for a certain context, because there's not always going to be, it's never going to be a case of like this thing is always applicable for everyone forever. It's going to be like, where does this little piece of the puzzle apply and what demographic is it? Like, it's hard to kind of, I guess, give a solid answer to that without being super general,
Well, I think in answering it the way you did, lend context to what the actual answer is, right? Because it is super vague, it is super general. I think 2 things like you glossed over right away was like, you looked at how to validate research, right? Like you talked about 2 studies and then went on to say systematic review and meta-analysis. It's like, okay, yeah. I think a lot of people need to understand how to qualify the research they're reading, because there's some stuff that's, I've seen better science on the back of fucking cereal boxes than I've seen in some research papers, right? Like if I'm looking at a single case study, it's like, a classic example for this is the altitude training mask. Like this scientific study reads like some fucking guy's diary. Like it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. But the backed by research, understanding that like that there's ladders to that, and then the broad answer in itself, by the nature of the answer, is the answer, which I think is something that a lot of people, when you read between the lines of what you're saying, is the answer. You need to read between the lines.
Well, because a lot of people will take that and then they'll run with it, and then there'll be evidence-based everything, but then they'll kind of use a study that's working with general population people and try and apply it to like elite athlete scenarios, and it's like that's the wrong demographic. That might be evidence-based, but it's the wrong type of evidence to support what it is that you're doing with that person. Right. So sometimes it doesn't fit.
With you, like, because I think you operate from a really good understanding of first principles that allows you to create that discernment and distinction around, because I think discernment is a quality across the board that people should probably be better at. But like you can discern based off of your understanding of first principles, because like there's understanding of first principles of biomechanics, of physics, of neuroanatomy, of cellular physiology that these are the tent posts, these are the cornerstones that theory can be layered on top of, right? So if one of these things, breaks a commandment of biomechanics or commandment of like, the neurophysiology or metabolism or something like that, that allows you, I think, to really start to discern and sift out the bullshit. So like when I'm advising people, again, I try and stay on my branch, but like, I think like anatomy is one of on my branch, that's the currency, that's the language that we speak in, right? So, and one of the things that I want to talk to you about, and it's an interest of mine when it comes to anatomical first principles, is a little bit more in depth around the pelvis and the rib cage. Like, because I think that's stuff that we've kind of both explored almost seemingly simultaneously in kind of expanding our knowledge. Because I built and this, not to rip on Pat, but like Pat, it does a really good job of summarizing things. It's about building a functional model in your head that creates a rule book, right? So my functional model is around shoulder, hip, and spine, being kind of a peripheral, outside in. Like we're shooting a gun, we're missing the target. Let's move the target, right? But now to calibrate the trajectory of the weapon, I think we start to look, because the way I look at it is like, okay, our ankles and our wrists are very structural in their integrity, like irregular bones, very similar, varying degrees of dexterity, but a lot of ligaments and inert soft tissues, right? Then we start to look inwards towards like elbows and knees, very similar. We have like a bone that rotates, a bone that hinges, right? We have some ligaments around like the two peripheral bones. And then we get up to the shoulder. Shoulder and hip start to enter into the realm of overlying structure and function. Then we work into the spine, and the spine is very much like central to function. But in between the shoulders and the spine, we have a rib cage and a pelvis that I think is a direct superimposition of structure and function that too often just gets binned in the structure category, right? Like we go ankle structure, hip function, pelvis structure. No, pelvis function and structure. And we can superimpose the pelvis function and structure, the muscles of the pelvic floor with the structure of the bowl of the pelvis, the muscle of the diaphragm with the structure and dynamic structure of the rib cage. So it's like, these are our closest mirrors before we get into the core of the spine that is almost entirely function. But this is our first branch out, which is superimposition, 50% function, 50% structure. Then we start to go into the shoulders and hips with contrasting contributions of structure and function, then out to the peripheral where we're almost reliant wholly on structure. So I think a lot of times people look at the rib cage and they look at the pelvis as structure, where it is probably they're equal parts structure and function when it comes to their integrity in the system. What was your first interest? Where did this stem from? And what were the things that kind of what were the principles around dynamics of the ribcage and pelvis that really stood out to you as someone who came in with a good knowledge maybe of the peripheral? And I was like this, but when moving into like a more in-depth look at these two things that were often just, binned and categorized as a certain thing, what stood out in your mind is like, wow, this is really going to be applicable. This is really interesting to look at through this lens.
I guess like I first started looking into this stuff when I was having a conversation with Chris Knott. I don't know if you know Chris. He's a coach from Manchester. Well, yeah. So yeah, he's a friend of mine who was like he pointed me in the direction of Pat, but Bill Hartman. Bill Hartman was the dude that I first started listening to when I was kind of going down this diaphragm / structural rabbit hole, if you like. And then I kind of went on to Zach Couples and Katie St. Clair, and I've done a little bit of a mentorship with Katie St. Clair that she runs, and it just kind of delves into the mechanics of the diaphragm and the rib cage and the pelvis, and how these things, I guess, have a relationship with one another when it comes to movement, and they can influence our movement options. And if we have, limited shoulder flexion, then there might be a reason for that at the level of the scapula, or the rib cage might have been affected in terms of its shape, or might have lost its ability to be dynamic in terms of when you inhale and when you exhale. And then it, like you kind of said earlier, it gives you a little bit of a principle or blueprint to kind of check things against and be like, right, that doesn't look right. So maybe this is the result of that, because you'll have certain relationships which are associated with different, I guess, structures of someone's ribcage. So we've got the infrasternal angle, which is the angle of where the ribs kind of meet under that xiphoid process underneath the sternum. And we've got people which are, let's say they've got different natural morphological archetypes. Some people are naturally wider at that angle, some people are naturally narrower, and these sort of angles at the rib cage are supposedly associated with differences in inhalation and exhalation biases at the skeleton, like the rib cage and the pelvis. And then when somebody is representing, let's just say, a wide infrasternal angle, then that would lead us down a certain path of intervention based on what they're showing us from their morphological structure. And similarly, if someone was narrow, then that would be a slightly different approach. And it's just kind of using, the diaphragm muscles and stuff like that into the context of exercise to have an influence either in a compressive or expansive manner in an area which is either compressed or expanded. You use whichever one you need at that particular point in time.
Right. And this is like differentiating bucket handle versus pump handle mechanic. Because you dive a little bit into like those two, because I think that trips a lot of people up. I literally have seen people walk over to trash cans and grab the handle and be like, I don't get it. Like when someone is referred to like, all right, so infrasternal angle, I think first needs to be clarified is it's not the angle of the sternum down from the manubrium and the tracheal notch. I think a lot of people get that tripped up, especially when we start talking tech training. It gets thrown in there a lot.
Yeah.
Like, oh, your infrasternal angle. It's like, no. Like infrasternal angle is like, look, we have 8 true ribs. They tie into the sternum. Then we go on to false and floating to make the full set of 12. But at the where the true ribs attach on, that 8th rib, essentially that 8th rib is then it now carries on that angle down into ribs 9 through 12. That angle that it makes, whether if it's wider, that's gonna be representative. Okay, you're like you said, there's a certain breathing pattern that you bias, and then there's a certain mechanic when we think about how a pump handle would work, moving up and like kind of up and down versus how a bucket handle might move a little bit laterally. So can you expand on, pun intended, expand on like pump and bucket handle?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I guess those two terms are in reference to the bones moving at the rib cage. So let's go with bucket handle first. So if you imagine, you've got a normal bucket that's got one of those handles kind of down, and when we inhale, the rib cage obviously has to expand, and that bucket handle has to move up to allow for that air to be, coming into the rib cage and fill that space. And similarly, when we've got the pump handle, which is kind of the manubrium, the sternum, and it's just, if you were to look at someone from a side profile, and they inhale, that would be the pump handle lifting, because the front wall of the rib cage is going to move superiorly and anteriorly, and that's kind of representative of that up pump handle mechanism. So the up pump handle and the bucket handle seem to work in synergy with one another through respiration. If that answers that.
Yeah, does it seem like when people start to go like maybe like, I don't want to say dysfunctional, but like maybe like pathoanatomical, when they start to bias infra or wide versus narrow, what are the presentations that you commonly see? Like if someone comes to you with like an exaggerated, because I think in my space, what I see more often is going to be that wide infrasternal angle, right? A little bit more common with kind of the meathead bodybuilder. Most of you guys listening are probably categorized under this wide infrasternal angle. So I think it maybe a little bit beneficial. Like, okay, someone presents with a wide ISA. What's going on with the pump handle? What's going on with the bucket handle?
Yeah, so under those conditions, like I mean, that's more what I work with as well. Like a lot of the people are like bodybuilders and people that like lifting heavy shit. So they're more predisposed to end up with a wide infrasternal angle, or even if they were naturally a narrow, layering the type of exercise on that we do in terms of heavy benching, deadlifting, squatting, that could make someone wider. So they might still be not as wide as what a typically wide person would be presenting, but they would be a narrow that has gone wider based from the type of activity that they're layering on their skeleton. So I think that's an important place to start, because the exercise choices that we make is going to have an influence in the response that our skeleton is going to kind of have based from the demands that we're placing on the body. So if you imagine that someone's, I guess, doing a heavy bench press or something like that, we're getting a lot of compression front to back. So we've got the pecs obviously pulling on the sternum, we've got the rhomboids keeping the shoulder blades in place, we've got everything kind of pushing that rib cage, we've got the support at the back. and it squishes the rib cage from like a front to back position, if you like, and that will make the rib cage like more, I guess, oval. Yeah. I don't know, people can't see me making the hand gestures, so it just helps me think. But yeah, so then like if someone's in that position where they've been compressed front to back, then the lower ribs are the ones which are going to be most likely to be, compensating, because like you said, the floating ribs are the ones that don't really attach to anything. And the bottom ribs are the ones which are the most malleable. So if we've got a bunch of compression on the like front and back of the top of the rib cage, then, our body still needs to get oxygen in. It's still going to do that breathing thing, because we need oxygen to survive, right? So your body doesn't really give a shit that we're doing 150 kilo bench press or whatever. It just wants to make sure that oxygenating the tissues properly. So the bottom of the rib cage will kind of change shape. The bucket handle will sort of come out wider to the sides, for lack of a better term, and the pump handle will be limited in its dynamic capability in being able to inhale and move up and superiorly anteriorly.
Yeah, I think it's something that's, so when you see it, you can't stop seeing it, which is pretty amazing to me. Like,
it's
because
weird,
I always ascribe to the camp of like rib cage is just structure. It's there to protect your heart. It's like, is it though? Like and that's where like I like this, and obviously like if I looked at like the structure and function relationship, and I once I recategorized, it was as if it made sense to me. It fit, which I really liked, because it fit within a working model that I already had of like peripheral structure, more towards function, and obviously shoulders and hips. The demand has shaped the relationship between structure and function, shoulder and hip, where shoulder represents more on the aisle of function, and hip more on the around the aisle of structure. Not to neglect either or, like shoulder structure can absolutely fuck you up, and dysfunction at the hip, as we see all the time, can definitely fuck you up. But moving central into the hip and pelvis, it's almost like I blinded myself to it. Or rather the hip or the pelvis and rib cage. I was just like, yeah, it's just structure. Let's get into the spine. And I was like, wait a minute. No. This is actually as we move from structure at the peripheral to, inverted relationship of structure function at the shoulder and hip, the glenoid and the femoral acetabular joint, then we move into the pelvis. Now we're at this one-to-one. We're at this one-to-one relationship where it's an equal trade-off, where your function can dictate your structure and your structure can dictate your function. Right. So I thought like, what a great relationship to tie in with the rest of this model. And for me, once I started looking into it and put that piece together, because it was just like structure, function, structure, and then pelvis, structure again, and then back into function. It's like, no, this makes more sense to me. So like, let's follow down this rabbit hole. Like, hey, we got a wide ISA. We're compressed, a lot of sagittal plane moving, pushing and pulling. We're not good at working in the rotary plane, right? We're not good at working through the transverse plane. Now, the assessment for most people is obvious. You can assess them from a mile away just by their presentation. We're going to have to do something with the over-exaggeration, because the bucket handle mechanic, I think a lot of times when people get into this, they think it's pathological. It's like, no. It's just the fact that the pump handle's not working and the bucket is the only place to go. That's why this is causing us issues. So let's take it to the level of intervention. We've done an assessment. We're looking to intervene with someone, wide ISA, a lot of sagittal plane movement, a lot of compression on that rib cage. We ended up with this ovoid. What do you do?
Well, I think a lot of it is going to come down to, the length tension relationships are going to be affected at, the muscles around the core. So like you kind of said earlier, we start axially and then we work out peripherally. So if we can kind of get someone into a better position for bracing, get them into some better positions for like obliques, their obliques are going to tend to be slightly lengthened, if you like. So we're going to need to try and get those guys, back pulling those lower ribs down on the exhalation phase. So that's going to be one go-to for those guys. It's going to depend on whether they've got any other layers of compensation as well, though, because like I like how Bill goes into, you've got kind of like second and third order consequences, or like compensation layers, if you like. So we can sometimes get someone that's a typical wide, but then they show some movement limitations which aren't typically representative of that, and they've created more compensation on their compensation that they've already got. So it's then you've got to be like, oh shit, it's like, right, so this guy should have like limited external rotation, but they haven't. They've got limited internal rotation. So it's just like, okay, then you've just got to kind of troubleshoot, I guess, and it's going to be a case by case basis. I think it's quite hard to, put a broad stroke across and say everyone's going to need obliques or everyone's going to need, abs. I think that it's going to be a case of seeing how someone is responding in terms of the dynamics of the rib cage. Like, can they go through a full exhalation? Can they go through a full inhalation? What is it that they're lacking? And then treat what it is that they're presenting us with, because we might think that we've, cracked it by just looking at the angle on the rib cage, but then there's a lot more to it than just that angle.
Yeah, and that's why I consider always my model, I think, is we're downrange at the targets. The gun is hard to recalibrate. So to ensure success and accuracy of the shot, we're going to move the target. So wherever the rifle is headed, we're going to hit that target, right? And this is where some of the issue might be in moving the target and calibrating the rifle. So the target is going to be, the shoulders and the hips, right? Our peripheral hubs of stability, because you can have independent, pathomechanics or dysfunction or like pathology that'll look, wide ISA meets labrum reconstruction with 4 anchors. It's like, you're going to have a different rotation pattern there. Co-pathologies are coexisting with morbidities from a functional standpoint, and being able to contextually rank order your findings and then being able to act in from an intervention standpoint based off priority, right? I think, and this is the hard part. And again, just listening to you talk about it, I don't want to use vagueness as a pejorative, but the vagueness in which you take it just means that, look, I don't want to give a hard and fast statement because it's all contextual. But I think one thing is, you want to, in a case of the wide ISA, if you do nothing else, you want to try and use the breath, because when I look at function, it's like walking and breathing. Use the breath to redirect the direction of intent through that pump handle, right? You can't make a move by my estimation until we've done that, until we get the lower ribs to behave properly, because we haven't even got into the upper ribs yet, which is but wait, there's more, because it's you thought you might be getting a handle on this, and then you introduce that the upper ribs also have an independent dynamic, top to bottom, left to right, that throws the whole spanner in the works as far as using this as a diagnostic model. But it's a very high resolution diagnostic model, right? And it'll allow you to see things that you might not see. I compare it to looking at one of those old 3D printed photos. It's it's always a fucking spaceship, but you're looking at this hallway at some party, and I don't see it, and some guy goes walk by, oh, spaceship. It's he's seeing it from a better vantage point. So I really think this information, when used contextually, is really going to give a resolution, add a dimension to the way you look at the mechanics.
Just going back to the hard and fast answers, this is where I think Instagram falls short. Everyone loves these fucking reductionist memes where they just try and be do this for tight hip flexors, and it's just someone doing fucking just end range hip flexor contraction, and it's just well, where are you struggling with hip flexion? It's at the bottom of the squat. It's well, that's probably not what you're going to need then, because is your pelvis anteriorly tilted? Because if it is, that's going to change the flexion arc of the hip, and then shortened range challenge is just not going to be what you need. I mean, it's not even the same type of contraction as it is for the hip flexor at the bottom of the squat. It's you're trying to use an end range overcoming type contraction in a position where the active component is the posterior chain, and the hip flexor is just kind of bringing femur to lumbar spine closer together on an eccentric yielding manner. And it's just that is the wrong exercise. It's me picking a shortened range tricep fucking exercise to fix overhead flexion. It's just not the right tool for the right job,
Yeah. It's, and I think, and maybe it's because it's a lesser explored avenue when it comes to, and lesser explored for, I think, a good reason, right? Because it is so complex that most people get. I find that people do similar things with the rib cage and pelvis that they do with the nervous system. They get to the edge of the border and they put their hands over their eyes and go, well, nothing else to see here. And then they just start throwing in terms. The second I hear someone throw it, because I know where it comes from. When you're a consumer, me and you are probably, you more so than I, but I consume more information than I espouse, which is crazy because I don't shut the fuck up all day. This is my 7th hour of podcast, and it's in the last 24 hours, because I love kicking it, because this is how I learn, right? I get to this is starred on my calendar. Because like just hearing like, you know, that quip about like you take for granted, but like I've come to value so much, like that quip about the hip flexor thing, someone's going to listen to that. You're going to blow their fucking mind. They're going to take the band off their ankle and stop doing mountain climbers against resistance and be like, oh, it makes so much sense. This is totally a waste of time. But like, to me, like that, the pelvis and rib cage structure function dynamic is only one layer removed in complexity from diving into like, you know, ascending and descending tracks and how we actually move, because it is of such an evolved priority in the way we move, with pelvis taking on walking, and obviously, you know, the diaphragm and rib cage taking on breathing. As like, this is the ramifications of getting this wrong are not dire, but like a lot of people I find spin their wheels trying to get this off the ground, and they don't understand the first principles to this level.
It's complicated, isn't it? And I think like that's why when you look at gait cycle and just walking in general, like you say, like the two main, you know, functions of human beings is walking and breathing. It's like if we can't do those two things, then, you know, what business do we have doing anything more complicated than that? It's like, so. And I think that when you look at someone walk, or when you look at someone run, or, you know, you start to build a picture in your head when you start to understand these principles of movement. It's just like when you know that supination, external rotation and flexion go hand in hand, and pronation, adduction, internal rotation go hand in hand. And when, like, you know, one leg's swinging forwards, it's supinating, it's externally rotating, it's, you know, flexing, and then the opposite side simultaneously is adducting, internally rotating and pronating. Then, and when you're looking at someone, it's just like, hey, that person's not going through full knee extension, like when they're walking. Why is that not doing that? Or, you know, they seem to be going side to side with the hips instead of like contralaterally reciprocating. It's just like, why is that happening? It just gives you, I guess, a sheet to kind of list these red flags and explore them further. And then you can think like, oh, that's not happening because this muscle's, you know, adapted to a certain length, and, you know, maybe that's done that because of this restriction. And then you can just start compiling like a little bit of a list of what you think this person's got to work on, and what muscles that they have to kind of improve the strength in certain ranges, and then you can retest. It's just like if you intervene and you think like, right, this muscle needs to be a little bit stronger in its lengthened position, let's put a challenge on that for a couple of weeks. Does that make it better? Yes or no? Yes, buzz in, let's keep doing that. No, right, back to the drawing board, let's reassess.
And I think that's the importance of evidence-based starting with first principles, right? Because it allows your evidence to have a power of one, which from a research perspective isn't great unless that subject is also your client, right? Like if you have evidence of a power of one, that's not, you know, if I'm submitting a paper and I have a power of one, like, it's not great. But guess who doesn't care? Your client is getting better, right? Like if they have coexisting, you know, pathomechanics that, you know, you're trying to reconcile maybe a rib cage presentation saying one thing, but a glenohumeral presentation or dynamic that's saying another. It's like, okay, now you like, all right, if this, then that. We actually get to create our own training intervention algorithms. And you know, we can reverse engineer kind of this ex post facto diagnosis based off of that, and that becomes a case study, and that's evidence based because you can use your own experience. So, like, to me, like, especially with, you know, the dynamics around the rib cage and pelvis, and how people too, like you talked about red flags. I think one of the things that it really taught me was what I used to think were red flags were actually just natural expression, right? Yeah. Like, you know, in understanding, I don't think I truly, and I think it's hard to truly understand the role of internal rotation and hip flexion, for example, until you understand the, you know, the confluence between those rib cage and the pelvis, especially obviously the pelvis, right? Like the idea that, and I struggle with this, and please help me, because I don't understand when I talk to guys that are in this like Postural Restoration Institute world, where everything exists in the transverse plane. I feel like I'm dropping acid when they tell me that, because I'm just imagine the whole world like an MRI, like just spinning fucking protons. Like, how does everything exist? But when you map out like flexion arcs, and you realize that accompanied with this flexion arcs is an inward and outward and back again navigation of internal and external back to internal rotation. It's like, that to me was my ultimate, like, what the fuck? When you were met with that idea of like, there's only movement in the transverse plane.
Yeah.
How did you deal with like the Lawrence Fishburne, like, all right, dude, red pill, blue pill, go ahead?
When I first heard it on a Pat Davidson Power Hour, I just put my phone down and just burst out laughing, and I was just like, fuck off. And then I just picked it back up, listened to it again, and I was just like, right, I need to fucking dig into this shit. But Bill Hartman like explained it really nicely. They put like a tube around a person or a model, and it was just like, you've got here is your like metaphorical sagittal plane, here's your metaphorical, frontal plane, and this is the transverse plane around it. Now, notice how you can draw a plane in anywhere within this like cylinder. It's just like any movement is just a plane within this circular cylindrical plane, and I'm just like, oh, for fuck's sake, like,
Dude, that's like, and like I remember being on a subway in New York with Pat. It's so fun. We got to do a podcast, me, you, and him, where it's like, where he was explaining like, a lot of this stems from a field called PRI, or a subset of like the called PRI. I was asking the same thing. Like New York subway, it's like fucking 6:30 at night, it's pitch black, freezing cold outside. We just did like some whatever podcast or something. And I was like, look, I got to ask you, man, like how does this work? And he talked about it a little bit, and he goes, look, some of the book, it just reads like someone was on meth. And I was like, oh, okay. Because like, again, like what the goal of it, and I think like, obviously it's a wisecrack and it's a funny guy, but like the goal of it is to create a functional working model. Right. And I think a lot of people get tripped up. Like, the internet's it's not a platform that lends itself to context and conversation, but like, someone can say like, oh, that's flexion isn't flexion. It's like, all right, dude, like you're looking at a tree missing the forest here, homie. Like what I mean? But take me through, like, let's stick with the hip flexion example, because this is something that I think I struggled with in the early stages of kind of getting on board with this. The rotational component bias through degrees of hip flexion, if that makes sense in saying that properly.
Yeah, so I guess we can go through this for the shoulder flexion arc and the hip flexion arc. They've both got a relative position of internal or external rotation, depending on which degree of flexion you're going through within that arc. So let's go with the shoulder first, just because that's easier to explain. So like, if you've typically got, on the books, 180 degrees of shoulder flexion that you possibly could potentially, get. So if we've got that sort of person, as they're going through like 0 degrees, arms down by the side, to 60 degrees, that's typically associated with inhalation and external rotation. And then as they're going through that 60 to 120 degrees of that arc, so their arm is slowly coming overhead now, that part through like the middle and overhead, beginning phase is the internal rotation and exhalation phase. And then back from 120 degrees to 180 degrees overhead, that then goes back to external rotation and inhalation. So that's kind of how the shoulder moves through that straight plane, but still uses a rotationary axis, if you like, to or at least be biased through those, rotational planes as you're going through flexion. Now the hip's a little bit different. Obviously, we don't have 180 degrees flexion at the hip. We've probably got more like 130, something like that, 140 maybe for some people. I don't know. But anyway, so the flexion arc changes. So you've got, the 0 to 60, or I think it's 0 to 45 in the hip. That's then associated with external rotation, inhalation, supination. But then from, the middle segment of that, from 45 to 90, I believe, something like that, that's then internal rotation and adduction. And then from 90 degrees to 140, that's back into external rotation. Now, the cool thing at the hip is you've got obviously the external rotator group, like the piriformis, obturator internus externus, and all those guys. And as you go, let's just say that someone's going through a squat. They're starting in a position of, external rotation, and they're starting to go through flexion. That then switches at that mid phase of the arc, what we just mentioned, back to internal rotation. So we're internally rotating. And then as we go kind of past that, as we're approaching that ass to grasp position, as the knees are starting to travel back, then we're kind of going back into internal rotation. Anyway, so the external rotators switch function from external rotators to internal rotators depending on which phase of the flexion arc that they're in, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Like their relative position from the femur to the pelvis as the orientation changes actually changes the muscle action at the hip, which I think for people around, because like you can read, and I don't know what Wikipedia is saying these days. I'm not on it very much, but like Wikipedia would likely tell you that a piriformis or an obturator is going to be an external rotator.
An external rotator, yeah.
Right, because these are derived from anatomical neutral positions, right? Like this guy here with his hands splayed out and his shoulders like palms facing open. In that case, then yeah, absolutely, it's an external rotator. But like that dynamic of like, wait, what? Like the muscle changes form, and it's like, and then you start to look at how it. And I challenge everyone to just go on YouTube and watch like a CGI kind of animatronic depiction of how this works, and you actually start to respect how the structure dictates the function. Right, because we spend so much time at the peripheral talking about function outrunning the structure, but then in that case, it's like, look, if you're in that part of that arc where the relative orientation of the the femur and the pelvis is in such a way, this is how a shortening moment would exact an action at the hip. It's going to change, right? Which is like fucking good luck wrapping your head around that one.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's not entirely accurate when we just label muscles with these single actions, and a lot of muscles change their relative function depending on the position of the bone. It's just like we can say that a lat is a shoulder extensor, but then if you take it past like level with your body and you go into like terminal extension, for example, your lat is going to be responsible for bringing that back to midline somewhat. So it's not then an extensor in that position. So it's like, the only thing we need to prove something wrong is to find one instance where it doesn't fit, for an absolute term to be bullshit. And I think that's, what we see a lot in these certain circumstances, because people, like to pigeonhole things, and they like to just have this nice little simple explanation for what something does, and it's just Mother Nature's like, we don't do simple around here, and and we've got to, then find out what other functions that muscle has depending on what position the bone is.
Yeah, and then I mean that to me, like, read whatever books you want to read. I think Darwin was a pretty smart cookie in that evolution. He was definitely onto something, right? And like it's evolutionary complexities like this that on the surface look so sophisticated, but if you think about like, why would someone with that, phenotypical or morphological expression, why would they be able to propagate better, right? Like we're biped now, which is like, that's kind of like not a new feature, but there's an old model you can find out there that's running like the old USB port. We're rocking the Lightning, but like that gives us a huge leg up, like literally a huge leg up, because we're no longer crawling around on all fours, like the efficiency that affords us. But what changes must have been necessary from almost an engineering standpoint? How do we get the Boston Dynamic killer robot dogs to stand up upright? How would we have to change the cogs and the balance points? We would have to create like an awareness in space that's far exceeding the quadruped position, right? And that's when we start to knock on the door of the nervous system. That's where most people get to Mount Doom and go, yeah, I forgot the ring at home. Sorry, we're going to leave Mordor now. Like this is, because I think there's so much complexity, and maybe we might have to save it for another time around the nervous system, because I think a lot of people, when they look at rib cage and pelvis, is enough for them to realize, like, most people don't even think it's something to go down. Like, we can get into a little bit, like, most people can maybe master nutation and counter nutation. Some people might be able to talk about the reciprocal position of the or of the sacrum, and then talking about breathing. Once you start talking about breathing in the sacrum, that took me, that was my phone down moment. That was like, wait, a word? Like, that was kind of me going like, what the fuck did you just say? Right? Like, and correct me if I'm wrong, an inhalation is like what would be a counter nutation or a posterior tilting of the sacrum, which is like such an abstract concept to be able to actually wrap your head around.
And that's it, is that I think a lot of people mix it up with, an anterior and posterior pelvic tuck, like counter nutation and nutation of the sacrum, and an anterior and posterior tilt of the entire pelvis is not the same thing. It's a relative motion. So when we're talking about sacral positioning and sacral nutation and counter nutation, the sacrum's moving separately or relative to the innomina or the iliac bones. It's like a nutation of the sacrum is basically, if you imagine the iliac crests are staying in the same place, but the sacrum is relatively tilting forwards a few degrees, to accommodate for that exhalation as the muscles are kind of closing those lower ribs in, and the pelvis is sort of closing that gap. And then similarly, as we sort of inhale, the lungs fill, the diaphragm descends, the viscera gets pushed down into that pelvic inlet, and then the sacrum has to counternutate or tuck under relative to the innominate bone, so we can make that gap at the top of the pelvis, for lack of a better term, bigger, so that it can accommodate for that like interstitial stuff kind of going downwards into that space.
And you know what, like there's so much there from a training perspective, right? Like once you realize, and not even to mention, like we haven't even talked about another part that most biomechanists don't consider, which I think PRI does a good job with, is like you got a liver, you got a bladder, you got like a ton, like you got about 30,000. You could circle like the globe at the equator with your small intestines or some shit. And this is going to have a structural relationship and be applying stress given certain speeds and decelerations or negative accelerations, like the pelvic floor, like we reference the rib cage and the pelvis, but these are markers. These are pinpoints that we can apply direction to, which is funny to me as a chiropractor coming up through school. A lot of times I got kind of like not reprimanded, but always kind of shone in a different light for being taught a structure first approach. Yet when I cue in training, I'm always cueing structure. And it's really, I think, gave me a leg up in when I was, working in group settings and strength conditioning or one-on-one or even remotely. Like I can tell someone to flex a muscle, and that's about as worthless a cue as I can fucking give someone. But if I can use bony or osseous landmarks, structural landmarks for people to tie, like if I move this rib cage down, how there's only one way to do that, rather than flexing your core or your trunk or whatever, your rectus abdominis. If I can landmark you and go, pull your rib cage down, right? And see that now as a call to action where function and structure can begin to move as one, because guess what? The rib cage and pelvis, they fucking absolutely move as one, right? Like people chase down, like a big one that I run into is like, you'll see female stress incontinence with lifting. There's no more to me, like, when we think of like what is going on with like the expansion and compression of the pelvis under load and, creating a wider interstitial space, it's like, this has given me a whole new light on like the idea of box squatting, right? Like I use fast deceleration, like I use fast eccentric box squatting for pelvic floor work. You'd be, dude, I swear, one of the funniest things, if you think this, like I'm joking, guys out there that don't do box squats, do fast box squats or fast squats to a box and try not to fart. Do it. Guaranteed 100% of the time. Someone that does that and isn't aware of it, it's just because stuff's like moving around and those muscles are usually weak. Like I have a really slow eccentric on my squat. So I took half the way and I realized like, man, my positional awareness, my ability to maintain pressure in this position is just not there. So what I'm doing is I'm just dropping my guts in from above and just having them drop into that, that interstitial space made in that bowl of the pelvis. And now all of a sudden this muscle trampoline has got to catch this payload that's coming with like 100, 200 kilos on my back. So it's such an interesting when like you think of the endless applications that these first principles could give you. It's really like, I think it's super exciting, especially when I get to chat with guys like you. Like what, from your perspective, from maybe a training standpoint, like is there an exercise that you find now? Like I know a lot of people are into like the 90-90 hip lift. There's no other sign of someone flying that flag in person. Like, okay, I got the 90-90 hip lift. Like, is there an exercise or exercises that you've kind of taken into your repertoire as a consequence of learning deeper first principles around the pelvis and ribcage?
Good question. I think that, it depends on what it is that we're trying to influence. So like you say, if you're trying to influence the pelvic floor, then it's like, we need to find where the pelvic floor is struggling to like descend, because when we're looking at someone kind of going back to that wide infrasternal angle example again, that person's going to have a more sort of like anteriorly tilted pelvis relative to what their normal position would be, and that would then open up the pelvis a little bit, and their pelvic floor is probably going to be let's just say less. It's going to descend less, or it's going to be restricted in terms of where it descends. So like you say, you would need to position the box squat at the relative height to where that person is struggling to achieve in terms of hip flexion. But then like you could throw something like a front foot elevated split squat in there or something and have like an internal rotation bias. And then you could inhale as you're going down to try and, drive inhalation to that one side of the pelvic floor, because it might not be both sides of the pelvic floor that's affected by this thing. It might have a pelvis that's got one side. Yeah, it might have like some torsion there. It could be on like an oblique angle where the pelvis is kind of twisted and one side of the iliac bone has come forward, so that like anterior superior iliac spine, the little bony prominence on the front of your pelvis, will sit slightly forward relative to the other one, and that'll be a clue there. And then you're going to be looking at, okay, so I need to look at rec fem, I need to be looking at hip flexors, I need to be looking at getting a relative posterior tuck on that side of the hip, but not doing the same thing on the other side of the hip. So it's going to be a case of, what does this person show us again, and let's fit an exercise specifically designed for that person's lack of range or whatever movement limitation that they're kind of presenting us with.
Yeah, I mean, just to dovetail off that, I think one of the things that this this revelation of thinking around biomechanics of these two structures, it creates an urgency for heightened awareness, and now all of a sudden greater utility for machines. Because a lot of times when people are on machines, like, we talk in the course a lot about internal stability, but, getting this like immediate feedback of like a lying hamstring curl to me, like, is so invaluable for so many people. Cause like, and taking it down the route in the context that you were saying, like, what if we have an anterior superior iliac spine that's rotated forward? It's like, if you're not aware of your body's position on the machine, you might not notice that, like, look, laying face down, like unbiased, you're actually biasing 70% of your load into that anterior tilt of that opposite hip. And now guess what? You can use that external oblique on that other side to begin to neutralize that pelvis position and get the perception through those anterior superior iliac spines neutralized. Now we're in like a true neutral. Now we can start to get those hamstrings to know strength at this. And it's going to feel in your mind like you're totally corkscrewed because you got one oblique posteriorly tilting the pelvis. But now all of a sudden your hamstring, and this is where, like, again, people get to the edge of the border of the nervous system. They cover their eyes like fucking Bird Box and go, well, nothing to see here. But like, and then people will do that and they'll start throwing around words like motor patterns. I love a good motor pattern smoke bomb. Nothing says, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Motor pattern. And they just fucking like leave the picture. It's like, no, what are you doing? Well, you're teaching your body now to zip a compressed file in like your pre and primary motor cortex that, look, hip extension, knee flexion, which, let's get back to function, is like, especially on a prone hamstring curl, is likely replicating the level or close to the level of hip extension that you'll get through in like a gait cycle. Maybe if you could do it properly, somewhere approaching like 25, 30 degrees of hip extension with knee flexion, with an accommodated pelvis position that's now neutral. If you do that enough, you go to run, you're going to know, obviously, the prone hamstring curl fairy isn't going to put a good sprint mechanic under your pillow, but you're going to have the zip file at the ready that you can call on and go through, premotor, primary motor cortex, and you can unzip this package that when you're running, your body knows a very fluid and a very simple dynamic between these relative positions. Like, hey, I got to stay front side in my sprint mechanics. So how do I do that? Well, I only extend the hip 30 degrees, maybe less, and then flex the knee. Oh, prone hamstring curl. Yeah, tuck the core down, keep the rib cage stacked over the pelvis, diaphragm over the pelvic floor, flex the knee. Like, there's so much that can be. I think it just adds such a dimension to your training and like the utility, like just little things like that. Because I think so many people are unconscious across the board, like, not to get too metaphysical, but like when it comes to like their awareness of their body, it's like a machine gives you tactile feedback. It's there for you to hone in on. Like, you're squatting or something like that. You might use a mirror visual feedback or poke someone so they know, oh shit, my knee's there. But on a machine, it's like, dude, you can, like, I think of it now when I do chest supported rows, like I think about how, and we haven't gotten into this, but like how, the direction of the breath, which you sort of indicated into the descension and the expansion of the pelvic floor, like how the direction of the breath through the rib cage can drastically like improve function through the shoulders is something that I think is, if there's a one takeaway that people should start doing, most people doing right now, it's, figure out wide ISA, narrow ISA, and obviously like lean your influence more towards like your particular bias. But the idea of like because again, it's so paradoxical. Like the middle and upper back, the posterior part of the rib cage. Talk a little bit about that, and like, what was your light bulb moment? Because I feel like when I'm looking at you saying this, we're kind of like, yeah, like I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so you're kind of talking in reference to that dorsal rostral space in between the scapula. So
yeah, the dorsal rostral space, and then moving up just to the idea of general posterior expansion. Because I think the dorsal rostral space is something that is conflicting giving context, right? Because we talk a lot about shoulder mechanics and giving thoracic extension. But if you're blocking off that posterior rostral space, thinking about how you went through that shoulder flexion arc, that's going to really limit your ability to get into that final stage of the overhead plane, right? And like thinking about how, and this is such another cool dynamic, is the idea that, look, your breath, yeah, it acts in so many different systems, but it also creates a pneumatic stabilization system and being able to create pressure with gases, right? Mm-hmm. Like and our blood volume, our blood and plasma do this in a hydraulic fashion that it works in conjunction with like our structural stability and our neurological system and things like that.
Well, when you're thinking about shoulder flexion, particularly in end range, you've got to think about like what could the shoulder blade basically just points its glenoid fossa in a direction which allows us to get, the range that we're trying to tell it to, what's influenced, or instructed by the brain. So we kind of look at it as like, yeah, it's upwards rotation, but it's not just upwards rotation across like one single plane, like a windscreen wiper. You're going to get like upwards rotation, but then at the top position, you're going to get the rhomboid kicking in and kind of like externally rotating the scapula or pointing it out and away a little bit to allow for that end range shoulder flexion to occur. And if the muscles in between the shoulder blades are not allowing for that posterior expansion and the like thoracic spine to move backwards in space relative to the shoulder blades, they can't create that same line of pull, and they can't influence the scapula in the same position. Now as well, we've got that on top of the ribcage shape. So if you imagine that the shoulder blade is going to glide across the ribcage, if the ribcage has changed its shape, that's going to change how the scapula glides across it. Because, if you, I don't know, I'm thinking of a fucking stupid analogy on the spot, but I can't quite think of one. But yeah, basically, if you imagine that you're squishing something and you're moving something across it, it's going to move through it differently, basically. But this is,
I think of the scap like hinging on like an axis, right? And the point in which, like, because most people, whenever I see, like, nothing tells me that you might not be deep enough into your anatomy when people draw the scapula, right? And they draw scapulohumeral rhythm and they draw it on a whiteboard. And it's like, okay, look, the rhomboids do this, the serratus does this. They explain upward rotation. They explain a little bit, maybe like, the superior anterior medial fibers of the levator. This is likely what's going to elevate our shoulder blade, maybe tie in some lower trap. But all I do is I walk up to someone with the whiteboard and I do this.
Yeah.
Now go. Now explain it, right? Because it's like we're not Paper Mario, right? So if I think about how the convexity of the rib cage adds like literally another dimension to like what you said, like it's not just this sliding and transverse or sliding through like, this, what we'll call like the coronal plane. There's going to be like a sagittal dynamic and a rotary transverse dynamic to it. Like, most people really going to struggle with the idea that the scapula externally rotates. They're going to sit there and be like, wait, so the glenohumeral joint externally rotates? It's like, well, yeah, but the scapula externally rotates.
And this is why some people fall short when they're looking on Instagram, getting these sound bites again, and they're thinking, oh yeah, phase pulls for shoulder health or whatever, and they're just fucking jamming them shoulder blades together even more, preventing further that fucking posterior expansion that they're lacking, making their shoulder range issue worse, probably. So it's like, yeah.
Well, I just think like, you can put yourself in a position like, because I think like if I'm trying to challenge a muscle, if I can challenge it through a longer range, I'm going to get more out of that muscle.
Yeah, sure.
The more I can drive breath through between my shoulder blades, the more space and more length I'm adding to those rhomboids that are going to squeeze those shoulder blades together. Right. So it's like,
I always like the Coke can example, when you open the Coke can and it's like you crush the air out of it. It's like if you keep the Coke can sealed, then try crushing that, then you're going to have a much better base for producing force from, and it's kind of the similar sort of thing.
Yeah, and like so posterior expansion, it just seems so paradoxical because we have such a low resolution model in many circles as far as what posture is and good posture and bad posture and how to fix it, that we're going to see a lot of people with limited posterior expansion have a forward head carriage. And that's actually going to decrease like their ability to think of like what's going on with the trachea, like how it is you're actually able to breathe in this position. Like that's a compromise. What a nightmare. Like when we look at function again with a little deeper lens, walking and breathing, this is not a great place to be. So over time, that posterior expansion, when we could okay, someone might have excessive, kyphosis through their upper back. It doesn't mean they're strong there. It usually means they're weak there. They're defaulting into their structure because they don't have any function. So putting them in that position and like, look, the only way out of this is if you pull yourself out of it yourself. Yeah. Right. So, rowing motions with directional breath through and between the rib cage or between the shoulder blades is going to add more challenge. And almost, I don't want to use, I think using the word like set a reset button is a little bit misguided because it does take a little bit of work and a little bit of time. It's not like restarting your fucking modem or something, but understanding the first principles that we're trying to get back to and putting in and peppering these in throughout your program, I think is something that's so valuable.
And just going back to that forward head posture thing, and this is why like sometimes people will just blame one muscle, like, oh, it's your tight pecs and your weak rear delts or whatever bullshit they kind of say nowadays. It's when I like it when you explained you've got like the bullseye and it's the center of mass over the base of support. And when you're thinking about like, your head weighs quite a bit of, your head's got quite a mass to it. And if you think that the further the head goes forward, the more that moment arm relative to the middle position changes. So then something else is going to have to go backwards to kind of recenter or realign that center of mass over that base of support. So then when you see people with that, like either, whatever tucked under pelvis or, their rib cage might be pushed back, the head might be pushed forward. All of these different sort of skeletal representations are just like your body trying to create a perceived center of mass. So it thinks, like we're not going to fall over whilst walking, but then that influences gait. And then you kind of, thinking, oh, fuck, there's like 35 muscles that I've got to look at here instead of just the fucking tight pecs and rear delts.
Right. Yeah. The Jonda anterior or the Jonda upper cross, lower cross model should go the way of the dodo bird, right? Like, because it is, but in a way, like just replace it. Like it's a little bit more difficult, but it's infinitely more informative. Like having a good basis. Like if I were to teach someone or instruct someone on like where I don't want to say where to start, but like where to really look to take their understanding to the next level. Because I think understanding the components of the peripheral is infinitely valuable. But I think like, you could get someone and with a good understanding of like the mechanics of like shoulder, hip, and spine, you can it's a good heuristic, right? It's a good way to get most of the people most of the way. But if you want to get 100% of people 100% of the way, you need to go all the way in. So like, because to me, like it's such a great stepping stone when we think about rib cage and pelvis. We think about diaphragm and pelvic floor. It's such a good stepping stone to look at like neurorespiratory physiology and then into the nervous system, right? Like looking how ventilation can affect respiration and how really like what is the central governor of this whole system, the nervous system, which is going to debunk a lot of our whiteboard theories around, sagittal plane Steve drawings and moment arms and torques and levers. It's like we're playing with a universe in our brain, right? Like we're primates with universes for brains, and like there's a set of rules that the nervous system operates on that doesn't give a fuck about your objective reality, right? Yeah. Like, what's his name? Buzz Aldrin he's got like a fucking 12-foot vertical on the moon because it's a different atmosphere, right? So we try to take realities out in our objective world and apply them to the internal atmosphere of our body and the nervous system. Like you said, not going to happen, right? So
Sorry, I was just going to say, that's why, like, whenever we're looking to influence something, it needs to be going back to right tool for the right job. It's like if we go to the thought process down the line of tissue load tolerance, and we're kind of putting stuff onto a tissue that's, in excess of its load tolerance, then it's just going to compensate or, find another solution to that problem every time. And I think a lot of people will regress in exercise, but they don't regress it enough, or they don't it's still in excess of that tissue's load tolerance, and then 3 months later they've been trying a bunch of exercises and they've just not hit the mark because they've not allowed the muscle to go through the ranges and the ability to strengthen itself as it's going to need to be.
Yeah,
imposed.
like it's just amazing to me. Like if you've ever watched a post-op ACL, VMO try and contract, like
Yeah,
it's just you get this fluttering
flickers.
fasciculation. It's like it's literally like aurora borealis in your knee as you're
Yeah,
watching it. Like I have some some knee injuries that I fight through, and when I can really lock in a terminal extension that puts under effective challenge, like the the vastus medialis of my quad, I can see my nervous system just sorting it out, and it's just this wave of like you might as well paint it green and put it over the sky in Iceland because it literally just looks like this natural phenomenon. So you can't simplify this on a whiteboard sometimes, right? Like the nervous system is just it just has other plans for you. Like it's such a complex system that and this is something that bothers me about a lot of this. When people look like you kind of touched on a little bit, load management, tissue tolerance versus applied force, right? Most people try and manage injuries like they're trying to create a flow chart of work in an organization. Like I see a lot of people taking on like almost like organizational behavior approach to like how you would build a team for a tech startup is how they're managing injury. It's like morons. Like nervous system doesn't give a fuck about your little model. I don't care if it's a Venn diagram. Like I don't care. Like,
yeah,
and I think you talk about people do I think fall into one of two camps with the nervous system that needs both keys to turn. It's like they'll talk about just reducing load, right? And that's fine. I understand that. Like you can reduce load, but regressing the pattern and forcing your body to learn a different path of least resistance that is routed through and around the compensatory movement that you've learned. And like this is again, people bird box it like Bullock. They get to the end of the fucking road, they throw on the bandana. It's like I don't want to know about the nervous system. It's like, well, then you don't want to know about learning, right? Because this is going to be like watch it. Like my sister has a 3-month-old daughter now, and when she moved, that's how she learns. Like she's exploring. She's every day she's challenging a new thing. But what she's challenging and how she's learning is through moving. And it sounds so cliched for two fucking trainers to sit around and be like, learning and moving are the same thing. But it's like, but let's Miss Frizzle this bitch into the nervous system with the magic school bus, and you'll realize that when we start to look at ascending and descending tracks of the nervous system, that's exactly what's going on. And a lot of these organizational behavior models just don't hold up because they don't consider the central governor of the nervous system.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those where we don't actually fix anything. Like the nervous system fixes itself. Like the body, we just give it options, really, don't we? It's like if your body's got a set of options, like you've injured yourself, your nervous system's thinking, right, we don't have access to the normal function of what we normally have access to, so it's going to create a solution based on the resources that it's got available to it. So when we go around thinking, okay, let's create a bit more flexion, a bit more this or that, we're just giving it a little bit more to choose from. We're giving it more options to create that solution. So I think that's something that a lot of people miss as well, because they'll try and fix things, and it's just like, well, we don't actually fix it. It's like the nervous system gets the final say in what goes down.
Yeah, like I always like I go a little bit deeper into like how like I've torn a few muscles off the bone, which is something to me when we talk about like we talk about like detrained populations and risk of injury and lifting. Like it's so minutes. Like yeah, if you don't have the right rotation and you're trying to like force rotation through a hinge, your elbow might hurt a little bit. But like what it takes to really tear a muscle? Like if you look at how the Golgi tendon organ is interacting with like, the musculotendinous junction and the enthesis, like the attachment of the bone and the tendon onto the periosteum, or the tendon onto the periosteum of the bone, and the down regulating signals that you're getting, that you as a stubborn lifter can just say, fuck you, do it. Like put a gun to you. Like it's like your ego puts a gun to the head of your Golgi tendon organ and says, open the goddamn vault. Like just do it. Like it's sitting there triggering silent alarms. And then all of a sudden, like the stretch perceived at the level of the musculotendinous junction that the Golgi tendon organ was warning you about, that's going to, that is going to succumb to a mechanical, like ablation. Like you're going to end up tearing that, even though it was giving you the prerequisite signals. It takes a lot of training. In my experience, it takes a lot of training to be able to push those physiological safeguards back and to a point where you can actually eclipse them. So I feel like a lot of the conversation when we start to talk about injury is like, it's such a fear-mongering language that never reaches the ears of anyone who's actually going to hurt themselves anyways. Like, like it takes more than a smile to really hurt yourself when it comes to lifting.
Yeah, well, you get a lot of people that, they'll be doing fucking 60 kilogram squats or something, and they're worried about the patella fucking snapping off. And it's just like, that's not going to happen with that amount of load. It's like, we're resilient enough to not, collapse under such insignificant loads.
Yeah. And we've evolved as such, right? Like, I don't know. To me, it's just, it's good to go deep on first principles. Like, and I literally had someone reach out the other day and go like, hey, you don't really talk much about anatomy anymore. Cause like we did it for the first, 50 episodes. And then it's like, all right, that's it. That's the body and no one's listening. Hi, Mom. And that was kind of it. And I was like, I fucking miss a good riff. Cause like for me, that's how I learn most is when like you get to kick the ball around. And I'll never forget you just sidling up next to me in Manchester, and just whispering sweet nothings of moment arms into my ears going like, this fucking guy's got it, man.
We were looking at meniscus tears and all sorts because I'd fucked my knee up at the time, and I was just like, we were just running through some meniscus shit as well to see if I've fucked my knee up, and it was just funny.
Yeah, and ever since then, you've been like my confidant when it comes to information, man. Like, look, I really appreciate the stuff you're putting out, man. I think your ability to go deep and broad, like the orthogonality of like your platform, I don't think is really touched. Like your ability to explain stuff in a nutrition to a level like where you can hang with the best of them, and biomechanics to a level where you choose to hang out with me. So thank you for that. Is awesome, man. And I think it's something that like, if you want to see a change, set the example. And I think that's something you're doing, right? Like coming out the other end of this COVID crap, I think trainers that want to do this long-term are taking things a little bit more seriously. And I think you're, how you look at sort of like this tree of coaching and the different branches that it facilitates, and your ability to really understand the concepts to their basically nth degree and back. And the back, I think, is one thing that you do really well that other people get lost on as they get to the end of that road and go, all right, give me the money now. It's like, no, you need to bring it back to the level of the client. So, dude, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your morning and hanging out with us.
Thank you.
I'll put all the Instagram stuff in the intro as well. But if you want it for those people who skip the intro because they know it's just all my voice, where can people find you on socials and all that stuff?
So well, first, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure chatting again. You can find me on Instagram. Matt Seaman PT is like my main Instagram handle. I do have like my other business page, what I'm trying to build, which is My Fitness Platform. That's like a bit of a subscription site that I've started developing over the last 12-18 months. So you can find that on www.myfitnessplatform.co.uk, and I've obviously got Facebook under Matt Seaman. So if anyone wants to add me there, then go ahead. And I think that's pretty much it. So.
Yeah, I can't underscore the value of the stuff that you're putting on that platform, man. Like, I feel like I almost don't want to promote it because it's the value that you're putting. And like I think a lot of people know, like, given like the nature of the podcast, like we don't do ads. And like, I kind of travel all over and I talk to a lot of people, and some people I meet and go, the first thought of my head is like, well, this person's never coming on the podcast. And there's some people I meet that is just like, this person is shoe in just because of like, just the passion level of depth of detail, man. So I'll put all that stuff in the show notes, and I'll spin up an intro where I get to really pump your tires and you're not around to sit there and say the otherwise. So that's the best part about owning the podcast, I guess. But dude, thanks again so much for coming on, man. Guys,
I appreciate
do check out his stuff. As far as this industry goes, we need more guys like you, man, that just get it on all levels, rather than me just sitting here as a super specialist insect just talking about one thing. No, man. Again, thank you so much for some of your time.
Thank you, mate, and thanks for listening, guys.